Hi guys, we're going to talk about Cold War Chapter 11. This is about Vietnam. You may have your grandfather or your father may have, or moms may have served in Vietnam, and so you might sit down and talk to them and ask them what it was like and ask them to tell you about Vietnam and what they were doing during those years in the 60s. So we're going to continue on with our lesson here and try to get you going with this assignment. So the same thing we're going to do before. We have the test questions are up here on this side, and all the test questions can be found in here. So pay attention to the test questions so when we go through and read this, you'll have an understanding of what they're talking about. The names of the two countries in the west of Vietnam through which parts of Ho Chi Minh Trail went were named. What are the two countries to the west? To the west of Vietnam. They're on here, right here. Laos and Cambodia. Saigon is the capital of what? Hanoi is the capital of what? What was the final battle that threw the French out of Vietnam? What was that final battle called? Okay, it was a conflict that devastated one nation and divided another. Vietnam brought a new dimension to the Cold War and forced the United States to rethink its goals in the superpower rivalry. We were divided. For 8 years, Vietnam was a colonial battleground as French fought a nationalist movement led by Ho Chi Minh. Despite financial backing from the United States, the French lost control of Vietnam in 1954 after the Vietnamese force captured the French outpost in Dien Bien Phu. They surrounded that fort and took it over. It was actually manned by the French Foreign Legion, and most of the soldiers most of the soldiers were Germans. I was in North Vietnam during these years. And most of the soldiers were actually German soldiers, and some of them were SS guys that ran away after World War II and joined the French Foreign Legion. And so the United States, Eisenhower, refused to give them air cover. They asked the United States for air cover support, and the United States refused. Eisenhower did not want to get involved in a war in Asia, and so he refused and did not allow our air forces to support the French at Dien Bien Phu, and the French lost and the Vietnamese won. An international peace conference in Geneva temporarily divided Vietnam into two communist-led North and non-communist South and agreed that the countrywide elections would be held in 1956. America opposed the elections, fearing the communists would gain control. The elections were never held. So now you can answer these questions. Pause it and answer these questions. And also you can open up your test and answer the test while you're doing this. Keep it open in another tab. Now in this section, we're going to talk about Vietnam being divided. What was the name of the divide between the North and South Vietnam? That's pretty simple. Communist preaches atheism, and they have been persecuting Catholics for a long time. At one time, a large percentage of the Vietnamese people were Catholics, and Vietnam's Catholics were afraid of the communists. After 1955, where did most of the Vietnamese Catholics reside? Where did they go after 1955? So let's read about this. Divided. For 8 years, Vietnam was a colonial battleground as French fought the nationalist movement led by Ho Chi Minh. Despite financial backing from the United States, the French lost control of Vietnam after the Vietnamese force captured the French outpost in Dien Bien Phu. Already read that, didn't I? The DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, that's what it means, Demilitarized Zone. It's a zone in the area where there's no military, and it's right here. Vietnam's Demilitarized Zone was established in 1954 at the Geneva Conference, which created Vietnam from the former French colony of Indochina. It was meant to be a temporary divide between the rival governments of the North and the South. A 6-mile wide buffer zone, but the DMZ soon became a de facto border between Communist North and Catholic South Vietnam. And that really became, and I was up here in North Vietnam, and we were bringing Catholics from the North and bringing them down to South Vietnam because they were scared to death of the Communists. The Communists do not like Catholics, and they persecute them routinely. So that's what we were doing, and I was a ship bringing them from the north down to the south. And I went on Liberty a few times at Hai Phong, the North Vietnamese port, the main port in North Vietnam. I'll tell you stories about that when we get back in school. I'll tell you some more stories. Iron Fist. Now, what U.S. president began America's involvement in Vietnam? What president started that? What got us involved in the first place? Who was leader of South Vietnam in the early 60s? What fact made Vietnam part of the Cold War and more than just a civil war between Vietnam factions? Why did it become a Cold War item instead of just an argument between the North and the South? And finally, what did millions of people flee from north to south? Why did they move from north to the south? And then you'll explain that. Here's Kennedy. Here's President Diem. He was a Catholic, and he was the president of South Vietnam at one time. Here's Ho Chi Minh. He was the president of North Vietnam, the communist North Vietnam. So let's read about this. The North Vietnamese embarked on a radical land reforms, persecuting and imprisoning landowners and aggravating a refugee crisis. In 1955, close to 1 million people had fled south. 1 million people left North Vietnam and went south. They left socialism. It seems that people in this world are always running away from socialism. In South Vietnam, the United States supported the regime of President Nguyen Diem. He was a Catholic, an anti-communist, determined to resist Hanoi. Hanoi, when they say Hanoi, they mean North Vietnam. Hanoi is the capital of North Vietnam. To fight Diem and unite Vietnam under the Hanoi government, the communities in 1960 created the National Liberation Front, the guerrilla organization also known as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong, it's an important organization because they were the guerrilla forces causing havoc with the Americans in Vietnam. Groups such as the Viet Cong were encouraged by Moscow. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, after suffering a setback against the communists in Cuba, remember he got kicked out of Cuba with the missiles, we had a problem there, and trying to control the crisis in Berlin. Remember they built the Berlin Wall. Kennedy went on a conference in Vienna soon after he got elected, and he thought he was just going to go and take all these people and just, I'll be able to convince them to come along to America's way of thinking. He was very anti-communist, Kennedy was. Well, they got over there, and he was a young guy, and he was dealing with all these world leaders, Macmillan of England, and there's Charles de Gaulle of France, and all these big world leaders, and they looked down on him. And Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, they looked down on Kennedy. They thought he was kind of like immature, not very capable, and they didn't really have a lot of respect for Kennedy. Because of that, as soon as that Vienna conference was over, soon after that, Khrushchev put missiles into Cuba, and he built the Berlin Wall. Believe me, if Eisenhower had been president, he never would have done those things. He would have been afraid. But they thought they could manipulate President Kennedy. They found out they were wrong, but they thought they could. He sent American military advisors, John Kennedy did, to South Vietnam. His advisors, including Robert McNamara, began early to organize and plan U.S. operations in Vietnam. Probably more than anyone else, Robert McNamara was responsible for our strategy in Vietnam. It was his idea, this whole thing in Vietnam. And then he chickened out at the end and said, it wasn't my idea, and kind of threw Johnson under the bus. So this is the questions. What U.S. president began our involvement in Vietnam? Obviously, Kennedy did. This was Kennedy's war. It wasn't Johnson's war. And I'll let you answer the rest of these questions on your own. Now, overthrow. The two questions, which of the following statements are true? And you'll have to read these questions. It's all about the death of Diem, how he got assassinated. The generals who overthrew and murdered Diem had the support of who? Who'd they have the support of? The generals that overthrew Diem in Vietnam. Let me read about it now. Overthrow. Diem's attempts, remember Diem is the president of North Vietnam. Here you see him standing there. His attempts to control the Viet Cong grew more and more extreme and created growing discontent in South Vietnam. Several monks burned themselves to death as part of the public protest against the Diem regime. So these Buddhist monks went out in the streets and poured gasoline on their heads and set themselves on fire as to be opposed to Diem. A group of Diem's generals turned against him. On November 1st, 1963, they attacked the presidential palace, believing they had or would have American support. By the next day, the government was overthrown and Diem was dead, murdered by his own soldiers. Actually, Kennedy gave him a wink and an eye and said, "Well, it's okay." I don't know if he knew they were going to kill him, but he did give tacit approval for the generals to overthrow Diem. Well, the people of Saigon, that's the capital of South Vietnam, the people of Saigon initially responded with enthusiasm to Diem's overthrow. The coup left the country without a clear leader. All we had now in running South Vietnam was a bunch of generals. And there you see Diem. He was assassinated in the palace, he and his family too, unfortunately. I don't think that Kennedy knew that the generals were going to kill him. I don't think he would have given his approval. He never officially said he gave the approval, but everyone knows that he did. So now we'll talk about the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson was having trouble getting support from the Americans for this war in Vietnam, so we had a situation come up called the Gulf of Tonkin, and he got the Senate to pass a resolution about the Gulf of Tonkin. So why did President Johnson push for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that was in the Senate? Robert Mcnamara was a key player in the Vietnam War. Who was he? And I'll explain to you who he was. Where was the Gulf of Tonkin? Where is it? It's right up here in North Vietnam, next to Hanoi. This is red is North Vietnam. Who was president when the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place? What president was in power? Let's read about the Gulf of Tonkin. Within weeks of DM's murder, President Kennedy was assassinated. Just weeks after DM died, then Kennedy got assassinated. Vice President Johnson assumed office determined not to lose Vietnam to the communists. He kept former President Kennedy foreign policy advisors. He sent Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to South Vietnam to repledge U.S. support. This is a key time because actually Vietnam was Kennedy's war, not Johnson's war. Johnson didn't want it. He just wanted the Great Society. He was going to cure poverty and racism in the United States. That's what his main concerns were. But he just kept all of, the mistake he made was he kept all of Kennedy's advisors. And they were committed to this war. And so Johnson got sucked into the war that he didn't want to be a part of. And then once he got in, he couldn't get out without making the United States look bad. In August of 1964, the USS Maddox, that was a ship, an American destroyer on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, exchanged fire with the North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, the ship's captain reported that he was under attack again. Despite conflicting evidence, the Pentagon insisted there had been a second attack unprovoked against their ships. The incident prompted Johnson to push for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress. The measure allowed LBJ to wage war in Vietnam. So what he did with the Gulf of Tonkin, he said to the senators, he said, look, they're killing our sailors. They're trying to sink our ships. You need to give me the authority to do everything I want to in Vietnam to get this war over with. So what the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did, the Congress gave President Johnson a lot of power. He didn't have to come back to Congress anymore to conduct the war in Vietnam. Johnson advisors pushed for escalation of the war. That's what this thing is about, escalation. Escalation means making it more. So why did President Johnson give military aid to South and let them fight? Why didn't he just do that? Why did President Johnson give military aid to the South and let them fight the war on their own? What statement is true? And you have to answer these questions about the Viet Cong. What is escalation? What does that mean? In 1965, President Johnson did what? What did he do? You're going to get all those answers over here. And then who was president when the war ended in Vietnam? Who was the president when the war ended? Let's read about escalation of the war. The war getting bigger and bigger. It started out small, and it seemed like every week it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. In March 1965, 4 months after Johnson was elected president by a landslide, the first U.S. ground troops landed in Da Nang. Johnson was convinced that without the support of a massive U.S. force, South Vietnam was doomed. In response to the U.S. troop buildup, North Vietnam began to send thousands of soldiers to fight in South Vietnam. In the La Drang Valley in Vietnam's Central Highlands, the North Vietnamese and U.S. armies met in the first great battle of the war. It was an American victory, but the U.S. casualties were very heavy. A lot of guys got killed there. American GIs, meanwhile, found themselves in a baffling war. They were unable to distinguish friend from foe. They didn't know, when they were fighting in these villages and things, they didn't know who was a communist and who wasn't. They were unable to distinguish friend from foe. American bombing and shelling drove tens of thousands of Vietnamese from the villages, and American television networks kept a running tally of the U.S. troops' body count. Every night you would turn on the TV and you'd see this many people died in Vietnam today. This many people died this month. And then they'd show these gruesome pictures of dead American soldiers getting shot and wounded. Johnson attempted to force the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table by bombing North Vietnam, including the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the primitive but highly effective supply line that linked North Vietnamese to its fighters and supporters in the South. But the tactic failed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a road that went from North Vietnam, went partly into Cambodia, and back into Vietnam, and that's where they brought the supplies down to the south, to the guerrillas in the south. So North Vietnam used that to bring their troops and things down to South Vietnam. So The war might have been over a lot earlier, because the people that negotiating, we were negotiating with Vietnam for years and to try to end the war, but North Vietnam, they would just hang on. They'd say, no, we can go longer. They think they saw the demonstrations in the United States and said, these people are ready to hang Johnson out to dry, so we can get whatever we want if we just stick with it and don't come to an agreement now. I think they would have come to an agreement a lot sooner if they had not been so many demonstrations in the United States. Quagmire. Quagmire is when you get stuck in the mud and you can't move. So in this day, what was the quagmire in Vietnam? You know what that is. U.S. was supplying and helping South Vietnam. Who was helping to supply North Vietnam? Why did the peace talks drag on so long? And I just talked to you about that. The Tet Offensive was, and I'll tell you what the Tet Offensive was, and we're going to talk about it now. The quagmire. The growing scale of the savagery of the war in Vietnam created growing dissent back in the United States. Johnson was politically weakened by the anti-war movement. In 1968, communist forces launched a wide-scale attack through South Vietnam to coincide with Tet. That was a New Year's, the Vietnamese New Year's. The communists hoped to spark a general uprising across the country, a mission that ultimately failed. But the strength of the offensive came as a shock to American public and Johnson. He offered to begin peace talks with North Vietnam and announced he would not run for another term as president. He said the reason he didn't run for president, they're not telling you in this story, was because Bobby Kennedy decided when he saw that another candidate had run and Gene McCarthy ran in New Hampshire and almost beat Johnson in New Hampshire primaries. Then Bobby Kennedy said, I can get elected president. So Bobby Kennedy jumped into the race. Even though it was his brother that started the war, Bobby Kennedy got in as an anti-war candidate. And that's why Johnson quit. Johnson and the Kennedys did not get along very well. And he did not want to face the fact of being beaten by Bobby Kennedy, who he really didn't like very much at all. He couldn't stand the thought of getting beat by him in the election. He knew he would have lost to Bobby Kennedy if he'd run again, so that's why he decided not to run. In May 1968, peace talks began in Paris, but soon deadlocked. Richard Nixon, who had begun his campaign for the presidency, called for an honorable end to the U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The North wanted full control of the South, and the U.S. believed it could not abandon the South Vietnam. We went there because they asked us to protect them from the communists, and Nixon didn't want to just leave them, abandon them. The war was to last another 4 years, costing thousands more lives. President Nixon sent Henry Kissinger to negotiate with North Vietnam, and a peace treaty was eventually signed with Nixon and Kissinger. So now you can answer these questions over here just by getting the answers from here. Let's go to the next scene. Now this one, I'm going to help you with the answers here. These are the characters that were involved in the Vietnam War, and you may not know them by face, but I'm going to tell you who they are. And so get your pencil down and write the names of them, okay? Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, who went to work for the Johnson administration, was the main architect of the Vietnam War. And that would have been, where are you there? There you are, Robert McNamara. He was also instrumental in developing the bombing of Japan in World War II, the low-level bombing of the cities of Tokyo and small towns and cities. He was an architect of that, and he brought a lot of those same ideas to the Vietnam War. He's not in favor very well. Most people don't like Robert McNamara anymore. Who was in charge of the American military forces in Vietnam? That would have been a General Westmoreland, General William Westmoreland. Who was the leader of North Vietnam? 28. The leader of North Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh. Who was the president of South Vietnam who was assassinated in a coup? That would have been Dien, right here, B. Nixon's foreign policy advisor, who finally negotiated an end to the Vietnam War, a very smart guy. He also negotiated with China to open them up to the West so we could start having good relations with China. That would be Henry Kissinger. Very, very good diplomat, a very smart, very wise guy. He was pretty good at getting his way in international affairs. President of the United States who identified with the Vietnam War. That was President Johnson, got identified with the war, but it wasn't really his war. President who finally ended the Vietnam War. That would have been Richard Nixon. And the president who was in office when the Vietnam War started. That would have been John F. Kennedy. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you, thank you for your attention. I hope you learn something about the Vietnam War. You'll learn a heck of a lot more if you talk to your grandparents, your grandmom, your granddad, and maybe your mom and dad might have been in the war as well, depending how old they are. But thank you very much. We'll see you again, okay?